Hey folks, David Stewart here. It's time to talk a little bit more about games, and today I want to talk about the three different levels of gameplay, or what I call the three orders of gameplay. If you're wondering why I'm talking about games so much lately, it's because I really would like to do better reviews of games than what most people do. Most people think in very shallow terms, and in order for me to talk deeply about what games are doing from a design level, from a gameplay level, from a story level, I need to do a little bit of theoretical background talking, so that's part of what this is. Now, this concept, the three different levels of gameplay, this can apply not just to video games, it can apply to tabletop games, and it can even apply to sports, as I hope I will be able to demonstrate. So the three different levels of gameplay are the micro level, the macro level, and the meta level. That's the way that you can look at it, or the first order, second order, and third order. And one of the things that I find is that the most compelling gaming experiences, regardless of what format you're in and where you're actually playing the game, whether it's a physical game or it's a game like Dungeons & Dragons or it's a video game, these really compelling experiences have all three orders present, and the most compelling part of it is that highest order, the third order, the meta level, if you will. The first order or micro level of gameplay is what most people think of as gameplay itself. These are the things that you do in the moment in order to operate the game. In a game like Super Mario Bros., it would be running and jumping. In a game that's a little bit more complicated, like an RPG, it would be the monster encounters. That would be the micro level of gameplay. If you were playing a sport like football, the micro level of gameplay would be throwing the ball, running the ball down the field. In a collectible card game like Hearthstone or Magic the Gathering, it would be drawing the cards and deciding what cards to play. That's the micro level. The next level up from that is the second order, or what I call the macro level. This involves strategizing about the game and strategizing about the actions that you're going to take at the micro level. So in an RPG, the macro level would be leveling up your character, picking what skills you're going to pick at each level, building your character in such a way that the character is more robust for the micro encounters that make up the bulk of the game. In a sport like football, the macro level would be play selection and trying to pick what plays are going to counter your opponent's plays. In a collectible card game, the macro level would be collecting the cards and building your decks so that when you are actually engaging in a game, you have a better chance of winning. Even games like Super Mario Bros. Have a macro level of gameplay. This would be collecting coins and 1-ups in order to build up your stock of extra lives. In the easy levels, so when you get to the hard levels, you have more attempts to actually clear the content. It'd also be deciding when you're going to use a warp pipe, things like that. The third order or meta level is comprised of gameplay elements that are about the game itself. These are things that often emerge kind of organically and aren't really baked into the original game design itself. This would be things like player interactions, the way players organize themselves in order to play a multiplayer game, the way that players have to strategize in regards to other players and their strategies. If you were to put it into sports terms, the meta level of a game like football would be not just deciding what plays, not just executing the plays, but deciding how you're going to organize your season, who you're going to bench on what week, when you're going to bench your starting quarterback in order to preserve his health for the playoffs. That's meta level gameplay. We often don't think of it as gameplay, but it really is, and it is part of what makes really good games highly engaging. I think the games that have the best longevity and the games that are most compelling for players over the long term are these games that have meta level elements to them, whether they are emergent or they are part of the design. They are something that keeps the player interested for a long time. The meta level is actually the make or break point for games like MMOs or any multiplayer game, which makes them so challenging to create and to maintain over the long term. It really is a testament to the original game design and the emergent qualities it fostered that a game like World of Warcraft is still going after all these years, or a game like EverQuest, which has been going even longer, more than 20 years at this point. The thing about this top order of gameplay is that not all games have it. Not all games have a meta level. Not all games need a meta level in order to be compelling. Sometimes games can be very compelling for other things which are actually outside of gameplay. The best example is probably story. If you're playing a JRPG, the story is one of the most compelling things about the experience. It's not really gamified in a JRPG, though. You proceed through a narrative, and you are really just dealing with micro and macro level thoughts, not really any meta concerns. Likewise, if you're playing a game like Super Mario Bros., the game is about the momentary gameplay primarily, and meta gameplay really only emerges if you are in like a speedrunning group or trying to do something that is outside the normal bounds of the way people normally play a Super Mario Bros. Game. You can still have some meta level gameplay with a Super Mario Bros. Game. Super Mario Odyssey is a good example, with lots of people sharing with their friends and others how they managed to find various moons in the game, how they managed to get to them using what kind of special jumps, jumping on their hat, things like that. That is a bit of a meta-level emergent gameplay thing that happened with Super Mario Odyssey, but it's still pretty minimal. Let's go ahead and I'd like to apply these concepts to a couple of good examples. One is a collectible card game like Hearthstone. Hearthstone has all 3 levels at play, and all 3 levels are pretty engaging, which makes for overall a very engaging gameplay experience. The micro level is drawing your cards and playing your cards in a match, trying to decide what cards to play when to overcome your opponent. The macro level is collecting the cards, buying the packs to collect the cards, disenchanting cards, building the cards that you want for the decks that you want in order to get better at the game. It's mostly about the collection aspect. The meta level is building decks not just to have better decks, but building decks with respect to what other decks people are using. If say a Murloc Paladin deck is very popular during that season, then you maybe put some cards into your deck that are going to help you to overcome that challenge if it pops up. It's understanding the likelihood of encountering other player strategies and then creating strategies which are supposed to counter those strategies. That's a very emergent level of gameplay, and I think it's one of the things that makes Hearthstone pretty interesting. But it's also one of the things that I think turns some players off. They really just want to engage in the collection aspect, building better decks, and playing the game, and they don't want to have to spend a lot of time thinking about what other decks people are playing. They're going to crush their deck unless they put in certain cards, and not being able to play the game they want to. It could be a negative experience at the meta, but I think for a lot of players who are really into Hearthstone, it's the meta that makes the game so compelling. Likewise with another Blizzard game, World of Warcraft. We have a micro level which involves attacking monsters and looting them. You have a macro level which involves leveling your character up, selecting talents, and of course, acquiring gear. And the meta level is really the emergent level of World of Warcraft, and that is what makes the game fun. This is all the player interactions that you have, talking to people in chats, figuring out how to arrange a dungeon group, figuring out how to build a guild, which is something that exists outside the game to a large degree. Build a guild in order to overcome the hardest challenges of the game, to kill the final bosses of the hardest dungeons like Ragnaros or Nefarian or Kel'Thuzad. Or the emergent level could also be the player versus player combat that you engage with, either out in the open world or as part of something like battlegrounds or arenas. This would be strategizing about what kind of teams you may encounter in an arena. As you get up the ladder, you may see a lot of, say, Druid Warrior, and you have to figure out how you're going to play against that, or you may change what classes you're going to play for your arena season in order to counter whatever's popular. That's meta level gameplay, and to me, that is what makes World of Warcraft so darn interesting. The social aspect is, for the most part, emergent. It's not baked into the design so much as the design facilitates and requires the players to come up with this meta level of gameplay, to come up with organizing guilds, to come up with organizing arena teams, to figure out how to operate the game with each other, not just as a lone individual. And in fact, as the game has gone on, the game has become less compelling because the meta has been reduced. You're much more able to operate the game as an individual now than you were back during the vanilla days or even during the Burning Crusade and Wrath of the Lich King. So much so that it becomes a rather lonely experience, and the compelling reason that you picked up the game in the first place may be gone. You're missing out on a huge part of what made the game actually interesting. And when you go back down to that micro level of killing the monsters, killing the monsters may not be all that interesting. It can be a compelling experience, but it's not nearly as compelling as building the guild and doing the raid. The next example I'd like to point at is an RPG, Dragon Age Origins, and this is a great example of how the meta level actually can be part of game design rather than being something that is emergent. The meta level of Dragon Age Origins is story path selection. And while a lot of the decisions that you make involve kind of the illusion of choice, it still has a profound impact on the player because they feel that they are making important decisions, that they are taking an active role in the way the story progresses. So the micro level would be the encounters. It would be fighting the Darkspawn or fighting the human or elf enemies, depending on what the encounter is. The macro level would be developing your character, deciding what talents you're going to pick up for all of your characters, whether they're going to be a blood mage, whether your character is going to be a Templar, what's going to happen with your character selection. And then the meta level is going to be the story decisions. Who are you going to romance? Who's going to be your partner in Dragon Age Origins? Are you going to side with the elves or the werewolves? Which dwarf are you going to side with? Are you going to side with the mages or the Templars? These don't have a huge impact in the long run, but they feel like they have an impact, and that's really what matters. And in fact, you can make some decisions towards the end of the game which really have some very different story impacts. Story decisions that will determine whether your main character, which you've spent all these hours developing and spending time with, will live or die, or who is going to be part of your party and who is going to be part of your final victory within the final act of the game. All of that is designed into the game. It's kind of a choose your own adventure story. Stories like that can be part of the meta. This is different from a JRPG where the story is mostly narrative and really outside the scope of this entire discussion. It's something which is compelling into itself, but is not part of gameplay. In a game like Dragon Age Origins, you really are gamifying the story decisions. You have to gain approval and reputation with your party members in order to romance them. There's a bit of a game baked into that, and it works. The final example I'll give you, again contrasting from JRPGs which have a set narrative, is the concept of an emergent story. This is something which happens when you were playing a tabletop game like Dungeons and Dragons. The micro level would be doing an encounter, deciding how you're going to proceed through that encounter, whether you're going to use intimidate or try to persuade an enemy to avoid combat. All of that stuff is mostly micro level. Macro level is going to be leveling up your character, deciding what skills you're going to pick up, whether you're going to put an attribute point here or there, and how you're going to develop your character in order to best suit your party and in order to increase the power of your character so that when you encounter those micro level challenges, you're better able to meet them. The meta level is the story about the game. That's the story that emerges from gameplay. The players are making lots of decisions about how they're going to proceed through a dungeon. Events happen which are unexpected, and then you end up developing stories out of that. This is a little bit different from the modern approach to RPG playing that some people have, which is where they have a strong narrative that they're pushing their players through. Rather, emergent story happens when you're not imposing a narrative upon the players, but rather the players are discovering their own story through playing. You populate the world with NPCs, the characters interact with them, the characters find dungeons, they find interesting things out about the universe that they're exploring, and it creates their own story. It's your story versus the story, as I've said in the past. That emergent level of story is very compelling in tabletop playing, and this is also something that occurs in video games like, say, the Elder Scrolls. In the Elder Scrolls, the main story is not really all of that compelling in any of the games, but the story of how you interact with the game, the story that you make yourself for your own character, that's what becomes really compelling. It's the exploration level. You've created a world, you've created an ability to operate that world, you've created the micro and macro structure, and then you turn the player loose and they find their own way around the world. They find their own way to do things. They find their own way to overcome challenges. And that's what makes the game fun. This is especially true with the older Elder Scrolls titles like, say, Morrowind and Oblivion, where you can get things like extremely high acrobatic skill to jump on roofs, which make you unable to be touched by certain enemies. It really is a way of strategizing about how you're going to operate about the game. That stuff emerges from the systems that you just normally put in place and allow the player to interact with as they see fit. So the main point here is that emergent story happens at the meta level, but not all story necessarily happens at the meta level. If you're talking about a narrative, story-driven game, that's really outside of the gameplay experience itself. So hopefully you've enjoyed this little talk about the different levels of gameplay, the different orders as I call them. First order, which is the micro level, second order, which is the macro level, and third order, which is the meta level. Not all games have to have all levels in order to be compelling, and indeed some games really don't need a meta level at all in order to be compelling, but I find that a lot of games that really seem to matter to players, including myself, have a strong component at the meta level, which makes the game really fun to interact with over and over again in some cases. So leave me your thoughts down below, and I will see you guys next time. Links are in the description for the newest books. The newest book out right now is The Keys to Prolific Creativity. It's a book on how to design your creative process, and I will see you all next time.